Welcome, dear listener. Come in, take a seat, and join me on a journey as we visit some of Gothic horror's great short stories, where the mundane turns to macabre and the dull to daring. So grab a blanket, a beverage, and settle in as we begin. This series starts with the 1825 short story Leixlip Castle by Charles Maturin. The tranquillity of the Catholics of Ireland during the disturbed periods of 1715 and 1745 was most commendable and somewhat extraordinary. To enter into the analysis of their probable motives is not at all the object of the writer of this tale, as it is pleasanter to state the fact of their honour than at this distance of time to assign dubious and unsatisfactory reasons for it. Many of them, however, showed a kind of secret disgust at the existing state of affairs, by quitting their family residences and wandering about like persons who were uncertain of their homes, or possibly expecting better from some near and fortunate contingency. Among the rest was a Jacobite baronet, who, sick of his uncongenial situation in a Whig neighbourhood in the north, where he heard of nothing but the heroic defence of Londonderry, the barbarities of the French generals, and the resistless extortions of the godly Mr. Walker, a Presbyterian clergyman to whom the citizens gave the title of evangelist, quitted his paternal residence, and about the year 1720 hired the castle of Leixlip for 3 years. It was then the property of the Connollys, who let it to triennial tenants, and removed thither from his family, which consisted of 3 daughters, their mother having long been dead. The castle of Leixlip, at that period, possessed a character of romantic beauty and feudal grandeur, such as few buildings in Ireland can claim, and which is now, alas, totally effaced by the destruction of its noble woods, on the destroyers of which the writer would wish a minstrel's malison were said. Leixlip, though about 7 miles from Dublin, has all the sequestered and picturesque character that imagination could ascribe to a landscape 100 miles from, not only the metropolis, but an inhabited town. After driving a dull mile, an Irish mile, in passing from Lucan to Leixlip, the road, hedged up one side of the high wall that bounds the demesne of the Vezies, and on the other by low enclosures, over whose rugged tops you have no view at all, at once opens on Leixlip Bridge, at almost a right angle, and displays a luxury of landscape on which the eye that has seen it even in childhood dwells with delighted recollection. Leixlip Bridge, a rude but solid structure, projects from a high bank of the Liffey, and slopes rapidly to the opposite side, where there lies remarkably low. To the right of plantations of the Vezies demesne, no longer obscured by walls, almost mingle their dark woods in its stream with the opposite ones of Marshfield and St. Catherine's. The river is scarcely visible, overshadowed as it is by the deep, rich, and bending foliage of the trees. To the left it bursts out in its brilliance of light, washes the garden steps of the houses of Leixlip, wanders round the low walls of its churchyard, plays with the pleasure boat moored under the arches on which the summer house of the castle is raised, and then loses itself among the rich woods that once skirted those grounds to the very brink. The contrast on the other side, with its luxuriant walks, scattered shrubberies, temples seated on pinnacles, and thickets that conceal you from sight of the river until you are on its very banks, that mark the character of the grounds which are now the property of Colonel Marley, is peculiarly striking. Visible above the highest roofs of the town, through a quarter of a mile distant from them, are the ruins of Coventry Castle, a right good old predatory tower of the stirring times when blood was shed like water, and as you pass the bridge you catch a glimpse of the waterfall, or salmon leap as it is called, on whose noonday lustre or moonlight beauty, probably the rough livers of that age when Comfy Castle was a tower of strength, never glanced an eye or cast a thought, as they clattered in their harness over Leixlip Bridge, or waded through the stream before that convenience was in existence. Whether the solitude in which he lived contributed to tranquillize Sir Redmond Blaney's feelings, or whether they had begun to rust from want of collision with those of others, it is impossible to say. But certain it is that the good baronet began gradually to lose his tenacity in political matters, and, except when a Jacobite friend came to dine with him, and drink with many a significant nod and beck and smile, the king over the water, or the parish priest spoke of the hopes of better times, and the final success of the right cause and the old religion, or a Jacobite servant was heard in the solitude of the large mansion whistling "Charlie is my darling," to which Sir Redmond involuntarily responded in a deep bass voice, somewhat the worse for wear, and marked with more emphasis than good discretion, except, as I have said, on such occasions the baronet's politics, like his life, seemed passing away without notice or effort. Domestic calamities, too, pressed sorely on the old gentleman. Of his 3 daughters, the youngest, Jane, had disappeared in so extraordinary a manner in her childhood that though it is but a wild, remote family tradition, I cannot help relating it. The girl was of uncommon beauty and intelligence, and was suffered to wander about the neighbourhood of the castle with the daughter of a servant, who was also called Jane, as a nom de caresse. One evening Jane Blaney and her young companion went far and deep into the woods. Their absence created no uneasiness at the time, as these excursions were by no means unusual, till her playfellow returned home alone and weeping, at a very late hour. Her account was that, in passing through the lane at some distance from the castle, an old woman in the Fingalian dress, which is a red petticoat with a long green jacket, suddenly started out of a thicket and took Jane Blaney by the arm. She had in her hands 2 rushes, one of which she threw over her shoulder, and giving the other to the child, motioned to her to do the same. Her young companion, terrified at what she saw, was running away, when Jane Blaney called after her, "Goodbye, goodbye. It is a long time before you will see me again." The girl said that they then disappeared, and she found her way home as she could. An indefatigable search was immediately commenced. Woods were traversed, thickets were explored, ponds were drained, all in vain. The pursuit and the hope were at length given up. 10 years afterwards, the housekeeper of Sir Redmond, having remembered that she left the key of a closet where sweetmeats were kept on the kitchen table, returned to fetch it. As she approached the door, she heard a childish voice murmuring, "Cold, cold, cold. How long is it since I have felt a fire?" She advanced, and saw, to her amazement, Jane Blaney, shrunk to half her usual size, and covered in rags, crouching over the embers of the fire. The housekeeper flew in terror from the spot, and roused the servants, but the vision had fled. The child was reported to have been seen several times afterwards, as diminutive in form as though she had not grown an inch since she has 10 years of age, and always crouching over a fire, whether in the turret room or kitchen, complaining of cold and hunger, and apparently covered with rags. Her existence is still said to be protracted under these dismal circumstances, so unlike those of Lucy Gray in Wordsworth's beautiful ballad. Yet some will say that to this day she is a living child, that they have met sweet Lucy Gray upon the lonely wild. Over rough and smooth she trips along, and never looks behind, and hums a solitary song that whistles in the wind. The fate of the eldest daughter was more melancholy, though less extraordinary. She was addressed by a gentleman of competent future and unexceptionable character. He was a Catholic, moreover, and Sir Redmond Blaney signed the marriage articles in the full satisfaction of the security of his daughter's soul, as well of her jointure. The marriage was celebrated at the castle of Leixlip, and, after the bride and bridegroom had retired, the guests still remained drinking to their future happiness, when suddenly, to the great alarm of Sir Redmond and his friends, loud and piercing cries were heard to issue from the part of the castle in which the bridal chamber was situated. Some of the more courageous hurried upstairs. It was too late. The wretched bridegroom had burst, on that fateful night, into a sudden and most horrible paroxysm of insanity. The mangled form of the unfortunate and expiring lady bore attestation to the mortal virulence with which the disease had operated on the wretched husband, who died a victim to it himself after the involuntary murder of his bride. The bodies were interred as soon as decency would permit, and the story hushed up. Sir Redmond's hopes of Jane's recovery were diminishing every day, though he still continued to listen to every wild tale told by the domestics, and all his care was supposed to be now directed towards his only surviving daughter, Anne, living in solitude and partaking only of the very limited education of Irish females of that period, was very much left to the servants, among whom she decreed her taste for superstitious and supernatural horrors to a degree that had a most disastrous effect on her future life. Among the numerous menials of the castle, there was one withered crone who had been nurse to the late Lady Blaney's mother, and whose memory was a complete thesaurus terrorum. The mysterious fate of Jane first encouraged her sister to listen to these wild tales of this hag, who avouched that at one time she saw the fugitive standing before the portrait of her late mother in one of the apartments of the castle, and muttering to herself, "Woe is me, woe is me! How little my mother thought her wee Jane would ever come to be what she is." But as Anne grew older, she began to more seriously to incline to the hag's promises that she should show her future bridegroom on the performance of certain ceremonies, which she at first revolted from as horrible and impious, but finally, at the repeated instigation of the old woman, consented to act a part in. The period fixed upon for the performance of these unhallowed rites was now approaching. It was near the 31st of October, Halloween, the eventful night when such ceremonies were, and still are supposed, in the north of Ireland, to be most potent for their effects. All day long the crow took care to lower the mind of the young lady to the proper key of submissive and trembling credulity by every horrible story she could relate, and she told them with frightful and supernatural energy. The woman was called Collogue by the family, a name equivalent to gossip in England or cummer in Scotland, although her real name was Bridget Dease, and she verified the name by exercise of an unweary loquacity, an indefatigable memory, and a rage for communicating and inflicting terror that spared no victim in the household, from the groom, whom she sent shivering to his rug, to the lady of the castle, over whom she felt she held unbounded sway. The 31st of October arrived. The castle was perfectly quiet before 11 o'clock. Half an hour afterwards, the Collogue and Anne Blaney were seen gliding along a passage that led to what is called King John's Tower, where it is said that monarch received the homage of the Irish princes of Lords of Ireland, and which was, at all events, the most ancient part of the structure. The Collogue opened a small door with a key which she had secreted about her, and urged the young lady to hurry on. Anne advanced to the postern, and stood there, irresolute and trembling, like a timid swimmer on the bank of an unknown stream. It was a dark autumnal evening. A heavy wind sighed among the woods of the castle, and bowed the branches of the lower trees almost to the waves of the Liffey, which, swelled by recent rains, struggled and roared amid the stones that obstructed its channel. The steep descent from the castle lay before her, with its dark avenue of elms. A few lights still burned in the little village of Leixlip, but the lateness of the hour, it was probably they would soon be extinguished. The lady lingered. "And must I go alone?" said she, foreseeing that the terrors of her fearful journey could be aggravated by her more fearful purpose. "Ye must, or all will be spoiled," said the hag. shading the miserable light that did not extend its influence above 6 inches on the path of its victim. "You must go alone, and I will watch you here, dear, till you come back, and then see what will come of you at 12 o'clock. The unfortunate girl paused. "Oh, Cologue, Cologue, if you could but come with me! Oh, Cologue, come with me, if it be but to the bottom of the castle hill." "If I went with you, dear, we should never reach the top of it alive again, for there are them near that would tear us both in pieces." "Oh, Cologue, Cologue, let me turn back then, and go to my own room. I have advanced too far, and I have done too much." "And that is what you have, dear, and so you must go further, and do more still, unless, when you return to your own room, you would see the likeness of someone instead of a handsome young bridegroom." The young lady looked about her for a moment, terror and wild hope trembling in her heart. Then, with a sudden impulse of supernatural courage, she darted like a bird from the terrace of the castle. The fluttering of her white garments was seen for a few moments, and then the hag, who had been shading the flickering light with her hand, bolted the postern, and placed the candle before a glazed loophole, sat down on a stone seat in the recess of the tower to watch the event of the spell. It was an hour before the young lady returned, when her face was as pale and her eyes as fixed as those of a dead body. But she held in her grasp a dripping garment, a proof that her errand had been performed. She flung it into her companion's hands, and then stood, panting and gazing wildly about her, as if she knew not where she was. The hag herself grew terrified at the insane and breathless state of her victim, and hurried her to her chamber. But here the preparations for the terrible ceremonies of the night were the first objects that struck her, and, shivering at the sight, she covered her eyes with her hands, and stood immovably fixed in the middle of the room. It needed all the hag's persuasions, aided even by mysterious menaces, combined with the returning faculties and reviving curiosity of the poor girl, to prevail on her to go through the remaining business of the night. At length she said, as if in desperation, "I will go through with it. But be in the next room, and if what I dread should happen, I will ring my father's little silver bell, which I have secured for the night. And as you have a soul to be saved, Cologue, come to me at its first sound." The hag promised, gave her last instructions with eager and jealous minuteness, and then retired to her own room, which was adjacent to that of the young lady. Her candle had burned out, but she stirred up the embers of her turf fire and sat, nodding over them, and soothing the palate from time to time, but resolved not to lie down while there was a chance of a sound from her lady's room, for which she herself, withered as her feelings were, waited with a mingled sense of anxiety and terror. It was now long past midnight, and all was silent as the grave throughout the castle. The hag dozed over the embers till her head touched her knees, and started up as the sound of the bell seemed to tinkle in her ears, then dozed again, and again started as the bell appeared to tinkle more distinctly. Suddenly she was roused, but not by the bell, but by the piercing and horrible cries from her neighbouring chamber. The Cologue, aghast for the first time at the possible consequences of the mischief she might have occasioned, hastened to the room. Anne was in convulsions, and the hag was compelled reluctantly to call up the housekeeper, removing meanwhile the implements of said ceremony, and assist in applying all the specifics known at the day, burnt feathers, etc., to restore her. When they had at length succeeded, the housekeeper was dismissed, the door was bolted, and the Cologue was left alone with Anne. The subject of their conference might have been guessed at, but was not known until many years afterwards. But Anne that night held in her hand, in the shape of a weapon, with the use of which neither of them was acquainted, an evidence that her chamber had been visited by a being of no earthly form. This evidence the hag she resisted with fatal tenacity in keeping it. She locked it up, however, immediately, and seemed to think she had acquired a right, since her hand had grappled so fearfully with the mysteries of futurity, to know all the secrets of which the weapon might yet lead to the disclosure. But from that night it was observed from her character, her manner, and even her countenance, had become altered. She grew stern and solitary, shrunk at the sight of her former associates, and imperatively forbade the slightest allusion to the circumstances which had occasioned this mysterious change. It was a few days subsequent to this that Anne, who after dinner had left the chaplain reading the Life of St. Francis Xavier to Sir Redmond, and retired to her own room to work, and, perhaps, to muse, was surprised to hear that the bell at the outer gate rang loudly and repeatedly, a sound that she had never heard since her first residence in the castle. For the few guests who resorted came there and departed as noiselessly as humble visitors to the house of a great man generally do. Straightway there rode up to the avenue of elms, which we have already mentioned, a stately gentleman, followed by 4 servants, all mounted, the 2 former having pistols in their holsters, and the 2 latter carrying saddle-bags before them. Though it was the first week in November, the dinner hour being 1 o'clock, Anne had light enough to notice all these circumstances. The arrival of the strangers seemed to cause much, though not unwelcome, tumult in the castle. Orders were loudly and hastily given for the accommodation of the servants and horses. Steps were heard traversing the numerous passages for a full hour, and then all was still. It was said that Sir Redmond had locked with his own hand the door of the room before he and the strangers sat, and desired that no one should dare to approach it. About 2 hours later, a female servant came with orders from her master to have a plentiful supper ready by 8 o'clock, at which he desired the presence of his daughter. The family establishment was on a handsome scale for an Irish house, and Anne had only to descend to the kitchen to order the roasted chickens to be well stewed with browning sugar according to the unrefined fashion of the day, to inspect the mixing of the bowl of sago with its allowance of a bottle of port wine and a large handful of the richest spices, and to order particularly that the peas pudding should have a huge lump of cold salt butter stuck in its centre. And then, her household cares being over, were to retire to her room and array herself in a robe and white damask for the occasion. At 8 o'clock she was summoned to the supper room. She came in, according to the fashion of the times, with the first dish, but as she passed through the ante-room, where the servants were holding lights and bearing the dishes, her sleeve was twitched, and the ghastly face of the Cologue pushed close to hers, while she muttered, "Did not I say he would come for you, dear?" Anne's blood ran cold, but she advanced, saluted her father and the stranger with 2 low and distinct reverences, and then took her place at the table. Her feelings of awe and perhaps terror at the whisper of her associate were not diminished by the appearance of the stranger. There was a singular and mute solemnity in his manner during the meal. He ate nothing. Sir Redmond appeared constrained, gloomy, and thoughtful. At length, starting, he said, without mentioning the stranger's name, "You will drink my daughter's health?" The stranger intimated his willingness to have that honour, but absently filled his glass with water. Anne put a few drops of wine into hers, and bowed towards him. At that moment, for the first time since they had met, she beheld his face. It was as pale as that of a corpse. The deadly whiteness of his cheeks and lips, the hollow and distant sound of his voice, and the strange lustre of his dark, moveless eyes, strongly fixed on her, made her pause and even tremble as she raised the glass to her lips. She set it down, and then, with another silent reverence, retired to her chamber. There she found Cologue, busy in collecting the turf that burned on the hearth, for there was no grate in the apartment. "Why are you here?" she said impatiently. The hag turned on her with a ghastly grin of congratulation. "Did not I tell you he would come for you?" I believe he has, said the unfortunate girl, sinking into the huge wicker chair by her bedside, for never did I see a mortal with such a look. But is not he a fine, stately gentleman? Pursued the hag. He looks as if he were not of this world, said Anne. Of this world, or of the next, said the hag, raising her bony forefinger. Mark my words, so sure as the... Here she repeated some of the horrible formularities of the 31st of October. So sure he will be your bridegroom. Then I shall be the bride of a corpse, said Anne, for he I saw tonight is no living man. A fortnight elapsed, and whether Anne had reconciled to the features she thought so ghastly by the discovery that they were the handsomest she had ever beheld, and that the voice, whose sound at first was so strange and unearthly, was subdued into a tone of plaintive softness when addressing her, or whether it is impossible for two young persons whose unoccupied hearts to meet in the country and meet often, to gaze silently on the same stream, wander under the same trees, and listen together to the wind that waves the branches without experiencing an assimilation of feeling rapidly succeeding, an assimilation of taste, an assimilation of whether it was all from these causes combined. But in less than a month Anne heard the declaration that the stranger's passion with many a blush, though without a sigh. He now availed his name and rank. He stated himself to be a Scottish baronet, of the name of Sir Richard Maxwell. Family misfortunes had driven him from his country, and forever precluded the possibility of his return. He had transferred his property to Ireland, and proposed to fix his residence there for life. Such was his statement. The courtship of those days was brief and simple. Anne became the wife of Sir Richard, and I believe they resided with her father till his death, when they removed to their estate in the north. There they remained for several years, in tranquillity and happiness, and had a numerous family. Sir Richard's conduct was marked by two peculiarities. He not only shunned the intercourse, but the sight of any of his countrymen, and if he happened to hear a Scotsman had arrived in the neighbouring town, he shut himself up till assured of the stranger's departure. The other was his custom of retiring to his own chamber, and remaining invisible to his family on the anniversary of the 31st of October. The lady, who had her own associations connected with that period, only questioned him once on the subject of this conclusion, and was then solemnly and even sternly enjoined never to repeat her inquiry. Matters stood thus, somewhat mysteriously, but not unhappily, when, on a sudden, without any cause assigned or assignable, Sir Richard and Lady Maxwell parted, and never more met in this world. Nor was she ever permitted to see one of her children to her dying hour. He continued to live at the family mansion, and she fixed her residence with a distant relative in a remote part of the country. So total was the disunion that the name of either was never heard to pass the other's lips from the moment of separation until that of dissolution. Lady Maxwell survived Sir Richard 40 years, living to that great age of 96, and, according to a promise previously given, disclosed to a descendant with whom she had lived the following extraordinary circumstances. She said that on the night of 31st of October, about 75 years before, at the instigation of her ill-advising attendant, she had washed one of her garments in a place where 4 streams meet, and performed other unhallowed ceremonies under the direction of Cologue, in the expectation that her future husband would appear to her in her chamber at 12 o'clock that night. The critical moment arrived, but, with no lover-like form, a vision of indescribable horror approached her bed, and flinging at her an iron weapon of the shape and construction unknown to her, bade her recognize her future husband by that. The terrors of this visit soon deprived her of her senses, but, on her recovery, she persisted, as had been said, in keeping the fearful pledge of the reality of this vision, which, on examination, appeared to be encrusted with blood. It remained concealed in the innermost drawer of her cabinet till the morning of the separation. On that morning, Sir Richard Maxwell rose before daylight to join a hunting party. He wanted a knife for some accidental purpose, and, missing his own, called to Lady Maxwell, who was still in bed, to lend him one. The lady, who was half asleep, answered that in such a drawer of her cabinet he would find one. He went, however, to another, and the next moment she was fully awakened by seeing her husband present the terrible weapon to her throat, and threaten her with instant death unless she disclosed how she came by it. She supplicated for life, and then, in an agony of horror and contrition, told the tale of that eventful night. He gazed at her for a moment with a countenance which rage, hatred, and despair converted, as she avowed, into the living likeness of the demon visage which she once beheld. So singularly was the fated resemblance fulfilled. And then exclaiming, "You won me by the devil's aid, but you shall not keep me long," left her, to meet no more in this world. Her husband's secret was not unknown to the lady, though the means by which he became possessed of it were not wholly unwarrantable. Her curiosity had been strongly excited by her husband's aversion to his countrymen, and it was so, stimulated by the arrival of a Scottish gentleman in the neighbouring some time before, who professed himself formerly acquainted with Sir Richard, and spoke mysteriously of the causes that drove him from his country, that she contrived to procure an interview with him under a feigned name, and obtained from him the knowledge and circumstances which embittered her after life to its latest hour. His story was this. Sir Richard Maxwell was at deadly feud with the younger brother. A family feast was proposed to reconcile them, and the use of knives and forks was then unknown in the Highland. The company met armed with their dirks for the purpose of carving. They drank deeply. The feast, instead of harmonizing, began to inflame their spirits. The topics of old strife were renewed. Hands that at first touched their weapons in defiance drew them at last in fury, and in the fray Sir Richard mortally wounded his brother. His life was with difficulty saved from the vengeance of the clan, and he was hurried towards the sea coast, near which the house stood, and concealed there till a vessel could be procured to convey him to Ireland. He embarked on the night of the 31st of October, and whilst he was traversing the deck in an unutterable agony of spirit, his hand accidentally touched a dirk with which he had unconsciously worn ever since that fateful night. He drew it, and, praying that the guilt of his brother's blood might be as far from his soul as he could fling that weapon from his body, sent it with all his strength into the air. This instrument he found secreted in his lady's cabinet, and whether he really believed her to have become possessed of it by supernatural means, or whether he feared his wife was a secret witness of his crime, has not been ascertained, but the result was that I have stated. The separation took place on the discovery. For the rest, I know not how the truth may be, I tell the tale as was told to me.